On July 30th, 2025, while the world expected applause, Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, stunned the globe. In an era where global leaders chase prestige like currency, he did something almost no one dares to do. He rejected the Nobel Peace Prize. Not quietly, not politely, but with a thunderous rebuke heard from Ouagadougou to Oslo. "I will not be your puppet," he said. With that single act, Traoré didn't just decline an award, he exposed a system cloaked in gold, built by empires and held up as sacred by those who have long silenced African dignity with trophies. His words shattered centuries of protocol and cracked the illusion that peace must be defined by the powerful. But this was never just about a prize. It was about a question burning beneath the surface of global politics. Who decides what peace looks like? And at what cost is it awarded? Is justice something to be bestowed by foreign committees, or reclaimed by a continent that was once stripped of everything, including its voice? This video is not just a story, it is a challenge to the world's assumptions about honor, leadership, and what it means to be free. From the deserts of Mali to the coasts of Ghana, from the elders in Togo to students in Nairobi, the echoes of Traoré's defiance have ignited a movement. This is a film for Africa, rooted in its languages, symbols, and truths. A mirror held up not to the West, but to ourselves. Because when one man dares to say no to empire, a whole continent begins to whisper, then shout, then rise. On the morning of July 30th, 2025, the Nobel Committee in Oslo opened an envelope unlike any other. Inside was a formal rejection, hand-signed by President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. What should have been a global celebration turned into a diplomatic firestorm. Within minutes, every major newsroom, from Al Jazeera to the BBC, from New York to Nairobi, was scrambling to confirm the unthinkable. An African president had turned down the world's most coveted peace prize. In the Vatican, a stunned cardinal reportedly whispered, "This is heresy, not against God, but against the global order." In Washington, the State Department called an emergency press briefing. In Paris, President Macron was said to have slammed his desk in disbelief. And across the African continent, from the gold markets of Bamako to the internet cafes of Lagos, millions stared at their screens, some with pride, others with awe. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, people spilled into the streets, not in protest but in celebration. Local griots sang songs of defiance at sunset. Children painted murals of Traoré alongside Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba. Elder women in traditional Faso Danfani fabrics clapped and danced, shouting in Mouré, "Our honor is not for sale." But why did this single act cause such a rupture? Why did one refusal echo louder than decades of speeches and negotiations? Because it wasn't just about a prize, it was about power. The Nobel Peace Prize, often viewed as the gold standard of moral leadership, had been wielded for decades like a velvet chain, dressing up global control in the language of honor. And for the first time, someone saw it for what it truly was, and said no. This moment, this refusal, was more than personal. It was generational, it was continental, it was the kind of rupture that rewrites futures. And now we ask you, our brothers and sisters across Africa and allies around the globe, what does peace mean if it must be approved by those who once colonized us? Can dignity be awarded by committees that never witnessed our struggle? This is just the beginning of a story bigger than one man, one nation, or one medal. If you believe Africa has the right to define its own heroes, rewrite its own history, and rise without permission, then this message is for you. Like, share, subscribe. Because the world is watching, but for once, Africa is leading the story. "While I am grateful for the recognition," he wrote, "I must decline this award. It is not a symbol of true justice. The Nobel Prize, manipulated by the G7 and their powerful allies, serves only to glorify false values." Those words, shocking in their clarity, landed like a seismic wave across continents. In the very moment President Ibrahim Traoré placed pen to paper, he was not simply declining a medal. He was redefining what peace, justice, and leadership meant, not in Geneva, not in Washington, but from the red earth of Ouagadougou, in the language of a people long spoken over. What stunned the world was not the rejection itself, but the meaning behind it. Because the Nobel Peace Prize was never just a prize, it was a symbol, a golden seal of approval, often used by the world's most powerful to knight their chosen icons, those deemed palatable, cooperative, safe. And Traoré? He refused to play the part. For decades, Africa's strongest voices had been muffled by diplomacy dressed in silk, awards, loans, strategic partnerships. Behind the shimmering veil lay institutions like the IMF, UNESCO, the World Bank, where decisions about African futures were made without African consent. But Traoré's words pierced through that theater. They want to crown me only to control me. I will never be their puppet. That one line, spoken in a closed-door meeting with his inner circle on July 28th, echoed the words of ancestors who once resisted colonial chains. This time, the chain wasn't iron, but ideology. Traoré didn't just reject an award, he rejected a global script. The script that says Africa must remain the grateful recipient. The script that says sovereignty can be traded for applause. The script that says peace must be defined in boardrooms where African voices are guests, never hosts. In that moment, he stood not just as a president, but as a griot of resistance, telling a story not of obedience, but of awakening. And that story challenged not only the G7, the coalition of Western powerhouses, but the entire global order built on hierarchy and soft coercion. Nations like the United States, France, Germany, and Japan, long masters of institutional diplomacy, found themselves disarmed by the one weapon they never expected: refusal. Where others saw the Nobel as honor, Traoré saw a velvet leash, a glittering shackle, a badge designed not to liberate, but to domesticate. He understood that justice does not need awards, only victory. And for him, that victory meant integrity, the kind that could not be bartered, bought, or blessed by foreign hands. His act was more than personal, it was prophetic. In Dakar, elders whispered, "He walks like Sankara, but speaks with a new fire." In Nairobi, university students painted walls with the phrase, "We crown our own." In a small village near Bobo Dioulasso, a storyteller held up a wooden carving of a lion and said, "He did not roar to be heard. He roared to remind the forest who it belongs to." Because when Traoré refused that medal, he didn't just embarrass the committee in Oslo. He unveiled a truth long felt but rarely spoken, that global institutions, however noble in title, often serve to stabilize the very inequalities they claim to resist. He dared to ask, why have so few African leaders received this honor? And why now? Is this an award or a muzzle? Would Mandela or King have accepted it today, knowing what lies beneath? His defiance exposed a system that rewards compliant rebels and silences those who truly shake the foundations. He did not fit the mold of the acceptable African, the reformer who smiles at summits but signs away mineral rights behind closed doors. He was not interested in being another name in the Western narrative of progress. He came to write his own chapter, and that terrified them. Across Europe, the media called him reckless, a populist, a radical. But in Africa, he became something far more dangerous to the world order: an example. Traoré showed that it was possible to walk away, to say no, to tear the veil and survive. And by doing so, he didn't just challenge the old guard, he invited a new generation to rethink the very foundation of legitimacy. Because in the heart of Burkina Faso, a nation scarred by conflict but alive with pride, a new principle was being born. True peace cannot be given. It must be claimed. True honor does not descend from Oslo. It rises from the soil. And true leaders are not chosen by empires, but by the people who remember who they are. The ink on Traoré's rejection letter had barely dried when the world erupted. In Washington, stunned silence swept through the State Department's corridors. Hours later, the U.S. Secretary of State issued a sterile statement. While we respect President Traoré's decision, we remain committed to supporting democracy and peace in West Africa. Behind closed doors, however, insiders reported a frantic scramble. "We didn't expect this," one official admitted to The Atlantic. "He was supposed to be a symbol of stabilization, not defiance." Across the Atlantic, the reaction in Paris was far less diplomatic. President Emmanuel Macron, reportedly blindsided during a cabinet meeting, exploded in frustration. "He is humiliating the very order that made space for him," he was overheard saying. For France, a former colonial power still nursing influence in the Sahel, Traoré's rejection was not just a gesture, it was a geopolitical rupture. It questioned decades of soft control through aid, diplomacy, and prestige. In Tokyo, the tone was restrained but unmistakably cold. Japan's prime minister, speaking in carefully worded phrases, expressed deep concern about the implications of rejecting international cooperation. The message was clear: peace, in the eyes of the elite, must remain a curated product. Traoré had disrupted the script. In the Vatican, a senior bishop went on record with La Repubblica. To turn away from a symbol of global peace is to embrace isolation. But many African Catholics heard something else entirely. Not defiance of peace, but the reclaiming of dignity. The media's reaction mirrored this divide. Western outlets ranged from shocked to scornful. The Guardian labeled Traoré's action a dangerous populist gesture. CNN ran back-to-back panels questioning his motives. Was it nationalism, ego, a political stunt? But in Africa, the narrative turned electric. Jeune Afrique published a headline in bold red: "Burkina Faso says no. Africa says enough." In Nigeria, the Daily Trust hailed the move as a declaration of mental independence. South Africa's Mail and Guardian ran a feature titled "The Day Africa Looked the World in the Eye." From the markets of Accra to the classrooms in Lusaka, the rejection sparked something rarely seen: a continental consensus rooted not in politics, but in pride. Elders remembered colonial scars. Youth saw a future unchained. Social media became the battleground where old power met new voice. On X, formerly Twitter, the hashtag #Spirit of Traoré trended across more than 30 African nations. Artists from Kampala to Kinshasa shared digital portraits of Traoré with Sankara's silhouette behind him. Videos of young Burkinabe dancing in the streets went viral. One clip showed a girl, barefoot, waving a homemade flag, yelling in Dioula, "He gave back our name." Meanwhile, global youth, especially in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean, began drawing parallels. Hashtags like "Uncolonized Peace," "Not in Our Name," and "Reject the Leash" gained traction in unexpected places: São Paulo, Manila, Kingston. For many in the global South, Traoré's act was not just African, it was universal. In contrast, elite institutions doubled down. UNESCO expressed disappointment at the erosion of multilateral trust. The IMF, in a thinly veiled memo, warned of new uncertainties in West African engagement. But their statements only deepened the generational rift. Young Africans no longer looked to these institutions for answers. They looked inward and toward each other. In Bamako, a university professor summarized it best during a campus debate: "The West sees betrayal. We see awakening. What they call a rejection, we call a return. To ourselves." The story was no longer just about Traoré. It had become a mirror. One that forced nations to confront who holds the pen when peace is defined, and who decides when the story changes. From the cocoa farms in Côte d'Ivoire to the Nile banks of Sudan, from Cape Town jazz clubs to refugee camps in Chad, one question resonated far louder than the outrage of global headlines: if this is what it takes to stand tall, what are we waiting for? Because while the world debated the rejection of a medal, Africa had already begun reclaiming something far greater: its voice. While global leaders debated the implications of Traoré's rejection, something far more profound was unfolding back home. Not in diplomatic circles, not on TV screens, but in the soil. 3 days after the letter to Oslo made headlines, Ibrahim Traoré was spotted knee-deep in red clay outside a small village near Kaya. There was no podium, no security detail in suits, just a shovel in his hands, and a line of villagers beside him. Together, they were digging an irrigation canal for the dry season crops. No cameras were invited. But someone filmed it anyway. The video went viral across Africa, not because it was staged, but because it was real. "This is the award," Traoré said to the farmer next to him, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not gold, water." That same week, he gave a speech, not at the presidential palace, but in a millet field. He spoke in Moore surrounded by children and grandmothers, some barefoot, some in faded prints of Faso Danfani. He didn't speak of geopolitics. He spoke of seed banks, of schools made of local stone, of grain storage funded by taxes, not donors. And the people responded, not with applause, but with action. In Bobo Dioulasso, a group of widows started a women-run farming cooperative. They named it Ensons Taba, the daughters who refused to kneel. In the north, a former soldier returned to his village and helped build a one-room classroom. He carved the words, "Peace is planted," into the wood above the door. Artists painted Traoré's image not as a warrior, but as a cultivator. In the capital, a young sculptor created a statue from scrap metal, showing the president holding a mango tree sapling instead of a rifle. Beneath it, etched in 3 languages, were the words, "Dignity grows here." Soon, what began as spontaneous gestures became something larger, a national movement. Across provinces, communities gathered to host the first Spirit of Traoré Festival, a grassroots celebration with no government sponsorship and no foreign NGOs. There were no celebrity speakers. Instead, griots told stories under the baobab trees, drummers played rhythms of resistance, and villagers danced in circles, component placement lifting baskets of yam and clay pots of water in gratitude. The most striking part? No one asked for recognition, because something deeper was growing. Trust. In eastern provinces, a program called Farmers of Peace quietly took root. Ex-combatants traded rifles for hoes. Displaced families returned to land they thought they'd lost forever. Children once too afraid to walk to school now ran down dirt roads with books under their arms. It wasn't ideology that moved people. It was results. This wasn't symbolic politics. This was tangible change, from the dirt, from the people. While the world argued about medals, Burkina Faso was building something more enduring, a living proof that leadership is not measured in applause, but in harvests. And in the words whispered by an elder in Yako, seated on a woven mat beneath the sun, "We don't need a prize to know what a leader looks like. We can feel it in the rain returning, in the laughter of our children, and in the sound of the shovel, not the speech." Long after the headlines faded and the cameras moved on, the real impact of Traoré's decision continued to ripple. Not through press releases, but through consciousness. From the terraces of Addis Ababa to the fishing boats of Senegal, conversations began to shift. Not about politics, but about principle. In cafes and classrooms, in markets and mosques, people asked a question long buried beneath global applause. What is peace, really? For decades, peace was handed down in declarations and polished speeches, awarded like a trophy to those who spoke softly enough not to disturb the balance of power. But in Traoré's refusal, a new definition began to take root, not only in Burkina Faso, but across Africa. Peace, he reminded us, is not the absence of noise. It is the presence of justice. And leadership? It's not the spotlight, nor the stage. It's found in the quiet decisions no one claps for, the digging of a canal, the reopening of a village school, the sleepless nights rebuilding a nation from ash. In Traoré's model, leadership does not arrive by invitation. It rises from the soil. It walks among its people, speaks their language, shares their sweat. It plants trees, knowing it may never sit in their shade. That idea, once radical, is now echoed in the songs of schoolchildren and etched into village walls. Honor is what you water, not what you wear. Across the continent, a shift has begun. Young leaders, once told to mimic the West, now look inward. Elders, once silenced by foreign doctrines, are now revered again as keepers of truth. African universities are hosting panels not on Western governance models, but on Sankara, Lumumba, Nyerere, and now Traoré. This is not nostalgia, It is rebirth. Because when a man says no to power and yes to dignity, something ancient stirs. A memory of sovereignty, a rhythm older than borders, a wisdom that cannot be colonized. And as the dust settles, a final question lingers. Not for Traoré, but for us. Who are we still clapping for, and why? If peace must come with strings, is it peace at all? If leadership must wear medals, what does that say about the hands that never stop working, even in the dark? This story may have begun in Burkina Faso, but it belongs to every soul who has ever asked for nothing but the right to stand with dignity. If this moved you, share it. If it made you question, subscribe. Because this is no longer just a story. It is a call, soft, steady, and rising, from the heart of a continent that remembers who it is. Let the world hear Africa. And this time, let it not be through applause, but through truth. Some stories don't end. They echo. And the story of Ibrahim Traoré, of a leader who turned down the world's highest honor in favor of something far more sacred, still echoes across red earth and city sky alike. He did not take the Nobel Peace Prize. He took something the world had forgotten, his people's trust. In a century where prestige is bought with silence and dignity is traded for visibility, Traoré chose a different path, one carved not with headlines but with harvests. He stood beneath no spotlight. He stood beside his people. And in doing so, he redefined everything. He reminded us that peace is not something awarded. It is something built, with cracked hands, shared bread, and collective memory. He reminded us that leadership doesn't walk ahead of the people, but among them, barefoot if it must. And most of all, he reminded a continent long told to look outward, that everything it needs has always lived within. This was not a rebellion of noise. It was a rebellion of meaning. From the drummers in Niamey to the poets in Kigali, from the dancers in Harar to the farmers in Kudugu, people understood. They saw in Traoré not a perfect man, not a messiah, but something far more enduring, a mirror of possibility. They saw what it looked like when someone says, "We are enough." The West called it arrogance. Africa called it truth. Because when he said no to the Nobel, he said yes to something older than Oslo. He said yes to ancestral wisdom, to grounded justice, to a kind of honor that can't be staged, only felt, like the first rain after drought, or the return of a son once thought lost. And now we must ask ourselves, in a world that celebrates those who speak well, are we forgetting those who act quietly? In a system that crowns the obedient, who lifts the brave? We were taught to follow those who wear the medal. But maybe it's time we follow those who plant the seed. So let this not be the end of a video. Let this be a beginning. A beginning where Africa does not wait to be named great, but defines greatness on her own terms. A beginning where we honor the farmer over the financier, the teacher over the tactician, the one who stays when the cameras leave. Because long after the last light fades and the last medal tarnishes, something deeper will remain. The whisper of a leader who did not need the world's applause to know he was doing right. And the roar of a continent that no longer asks for permission to rise. This is not about Traoré. It never was. This is about you. And what kind of future you're willing to build. With your hands, your heart, and your name.